Okay. You shall not live. Where's it here? Okay. Okay, it's talking about forbidden relationships it doesn't talk about it as in depth as the other parasha. I can't remember what it's called, but it says a sorceress you shall not be permitted to live with a sorceress. Anyone who lies with an animal shall certainly be put to death. One who brings offerings to the gods shall be destroyed. Only to Hashem alone bring offerings. Okay. Okay, next one I found. Yeah, another one. Yeah, so into this evening. Okay. Look at that. Sorry about this, guys. Oh, here we go. Here it is. Yeah. Okay. There will not be a woman who loses her young or is barren in your land. The number of your days I shall fill. Okay, that's not really a halacha. Okay. Okay, there we go. Do not prostrate yourselves to the gods of others, and do not worship them, and do not act according to their practices. Rather, you shall utterly tear them apart, and you shall completely smash their monuments. You shall worship Hashem your God, and he will bless your bread and your waters, and I will remove sickness from your midst. So it mentions many times idol worship is mentioned, and that's another case of it, that Hashem isn't impressed if people worship other gods. Now, the gods of today are not what were of ancient times. So that's it, basically idolatry of worshiping other gods, as it's stressed many times, and it's to show how important it is or how serious it is.
Okay. Let's.
That's it.
Okay.
Do.
All right. All right, so I just want to give a quick summary of one or two of the concepts yesterday that we learned, that if a custodian claims an article was lost, then and he's caught to be lying, he only pays back the principal amount. He doesn't pay a penalty. And if he says it was stolen, but he never took an oath, and the original owner believes him, he doesn't pay the penalty. He just pays the principal back. So those are the two factors that we learned. We also learned something interesting, which Rava brings forward, that there are two oaths that are needed here. The one oath is that he never made use of the article, should he say it's lost. In other words, it's lost its usefulness. He has to take an oath, the custodian, that in fact he never laid his hands on the article. That's one oath that has to be taken. And if he claims it was stolen, he still has to take an oath that there was a thief. So either way, he has to take an oath. We also learned that if he doesn't take an oath directly, but he says the word amen to a statement given forward by the original owner of the article, that suffices as an oath. And therefore, the penalty would occur in such a case. Now, we learned in Pasuk Vav and Pasuk Zayin, Pasuk 7 and 8, that there is a bit of a discrepancy, okay? Because what happens is the Brisa brings that, so a hekesh is when you're taking, I'll give you a primary example. If you talk about the rules of learning Shabbos and building the Mishkan, we say that it talks about building the tabernacle, the Mishkan, and then after that point, it talks about Shabbos. We learn from the laws of Shabbat that the 39 creative acts to build the tabernacle is what is prohibited on Shabbos. That's a hekesh. It goes from one verse to the next. So too, when you go from Pasuk Vav to Zayin, there's a flow, there's a hekesh. And when you've got a hekesh, it takes over logical arguments because scripture trumps logic always. And one of the primary principles that you can see where this occurs is in the case of Adam Zimmerman. Because what is the logic? If an attempt of false witnesses that want to lay a punishment upon an innocent man, if they catch him, they catch the false witnesses during the trial as being lying witnesses, not false as in like made an error of judgment, but literally conspiring witnesses. We do to these witnesses what they wanted to do to the defendant and the defendant. In other words, say they were trying to have this guy killed, and they were found, and they said, yes, we saw him kill this lady at such and such a place and time, and there were witnesses that come to testify against the Adam Zimmerman, saying that these Adam Zimmerman are not correct. They're saying that they witnessed murder in Johannesburg. And in fact, there might be a dead woman or whatever. It could be a man that found this woman stabbed and tried to help her. But these false witnesses were found to be on holiday with this other couple in Cape Town. So clearly they were not there. And then, since they intended to do that during the trial, we give them the death penalty because that is what they wanted to do to this individual. So what do we learn is that you would think, if that's the case where we give that intended penalty for false witnesses that merely intended to do it to the victim but weren't successful, surely if they were successful, we give them the death penalty. Because they actually carried out their plot. And we learn no. We learn that if they attempted to do so and were caught before judgment, sentencing of judgment occurred, they get the Adam Zimmerman punishment other than otherwise they don't. So this goes against logic. Why? Because you would think that if you attempted to do something, you got punished. When you did occur and actually do that bad thing, and that bad thing actually came into fruition, there's absolutely no doubt that when you actually succeeded, that you would get that bad punishment. And the reason that that is not applied is because scripturally it's not so. But if you look at the deeper logic, and this is why you can't look at superficial logic, is because it's a form of kapara for the Adam Zimmerman, that in this world they suffer the sentence which they intended to do to the others. But if their heartlessness allowed them to see somebody die, and they thought they got away with it, they don't deserve the kapara of dying in this world. They're going to suffer the full wrath of Hashem in the next world. And further to which, we also know a concept that sometimes if there's by the based in, if a sentence is carried out on earth, we might think that a based in is earth. No, it's from Shemayim, and if you look in Pikei Avot, it says, you see that skull floating in the water? That skull drowned others, and therefore he was drowned. And just as those others drowned him, so too they should be drowned. So we find that any sentence that occurs here is because of a divine decree. There's no accident. And therefore, that's also a factor to take into account. But you can't apply kol v'chomes of logic that trump scriptural verses. So I just wanted to make that clear. Now, if we learned yesterday about the first brisa and the second brisa that talks about Pasuk 7 and 8, Vav and Zayin, the first brisa states that both of the Pasuks are talking about a shomer. In other words, a guardian that is caught lying that the article was stolen from him. And then it has to explain then how do you derive that the thief makes the twofold payment. Because if both verses are talking about the custodian, then where do you get the twofold payment for the thief? And we're going to bring that up. The second brisa is less of a problem because it says it's talking about a thief and a custodian. Just like a thief pays the twofold payment when he steals, so too when the custodian acts like a thief and keeps it for himself and lies, he pays the twofold payment. So far that's a review on yesterday. I hope I made it a bit clearer. I just reviewed what we've been going through because I've been reading klal, prat, inclusion, exclusion. So I hope I've helped you guys a little bit today. Okay. So now what I want to do is I want to give you some, since we don't have much time, I don't want to get in the basis of the discussion today because what I've learned is that this is a very, very long few dafs before there's another Mishnah. So we're going to have klalim and pratim coming out of our ears. So in the meantime, let's just do a bit of a summary where we are until now. So when we're talking about an item where a thief pays double, which is known as a kefil, it obviously applies in the Mishnah in more cases. In what cases? In the payment of 4 and 5 respectively for a sheep and an ox. Now that twofold payment applies both to living things, well, living creatures, you could say, and inanimate objects. And the 4 and 5 applies only to an ox. The 4 applies to the 4 applies to a sheep or a goat. By the way, it's not just a sheep. I learned it also a goat, funny enough, because we learned the Hebrew word seh. It has different interpretations, and the 5-fold payment applies to an ox. Okay, now one who steals from a thief, what happens there, guys? Do you remember? Does he pay the 2-fold payment?
I would think not.
No.
And on what basis do you say that?
The items, what is this? Are you stealing the thief's own items that he actually owns, or are you stealing an item?
No, because the thief, if he's a thief by career, but he owns it, he owns it. We talk about a thief that stole items from other people. Does a secondary thief have to pay a 2-fold payment to the original owner?
No.
No.
Why?
Kevin, you remember that?
Because the first guy stole, he's liable. He's responsible for
Correct.
Yeah,
But
going into
remember from a pasuk that
Um,
says if he stole it from the man. The man means either the original owner or the custodian that he appointed. I mean, we're not talking about a dodgy custodian. We're talking about a custodian that literally had a thief that stole from him, and he took an oath, and later they found the thief. So in that case, the thief then pays a 2-fold payment because the custodian is representative of the owner. He's got power of attorney and proxy to consecrate or sell it. So in that case, one who steals from a thief doesn't pay the 2-fold payment. If he later sells it or slaughter it, he doesn't pay the 4-fold or 5-fold payment either. So there's a first version of the Gemara, right? And it doesn't say that the 2-fold payment also applies to a guardian who claims that an item was stolen, whereas a 4 and 5-fold payment applies only regarding a real thief. Okay? So, in other words, there was a rule from Rav Chia bar Abba, said in the name of Rav Yochanan, that is slightly different to the Mishnah, because the Mishnah doesn't say outright. All it says that is that if that a shomer pays the 2-fold payment. Does that make sense? And it doesn't mention anything with regard to a custodian. So the question of the Gemara is, does the 4-fold and 5-fold payment occur to the custodian? Because we know the 2-fold payment occurs for a real thief. The 4-fold and 5-fold payment occurs for a real thief. The question is, if a custodian is caught having lied and stolen the item himself, it does mention about the 2-fold payment, but it doesn't mention about the 4 and 5-fold payment. Okay? So the first explanation is given by Rav Chia bar Abba in the name of Rav Yochanan, who says a custodian who claims the item was stolen pays a 2-fold payment, and if he slaughtered or sold it, if it's a sheep or an ox, he does pay the 4-fold and 5-fold. Why? There's no reason to think he shouldn't. If you're at the stage of paying penalties, why wouldn't you pay a penalty for 4-fold and 5-fold if you're eligible for 2-fold payment? So that is the first version, given almost as a statement, like there's nothing to discuss. The second version of it is actually put forward as a suggestion. Does that make sense? In other words, it's suggesting that the Mishnah might support Rav Chia bar Abba, but it's not a statement. Whereas the first one is a statement unequivocally by Rav Chia bar Abba in the name of Rav Yochanan, that if you pay a twofold payment, you pay a fourfold and fivefold. Second version is a suggestion that since you're paying a twofold payment, you would pay a fourfold or fivefold. Can you see the difference? The Gemara's explanation of Rav Chia bar Abba Gavin. First one is a statement as if, for sure, if you pay the twofold, you pay the four and fivefold. And the second one is a suggestion that Rav Chia bar Abba said in the Rav Yochanan that perhaps if you pay the twofold, there's no reason to think that you wouldn't pay the second, the four and fivefold either. But it's merely a suggestion. Now the Gemara doesn't agree with it because the Mishnah doesn't agree with it. And what does it say? The Mishnah doesn't say that these are the only differences, because there are differences that were not taught. Well, what are those differences? Well, we learned that there's a difference in terms of, is it only who stole it? With a difference, in other words, what was stolen. So if you interpret a twofold payment and a fourfold and fivefold, the first thing that your application is in the target areas of what is stolen. Is it eligible for a twofold payment or a fourfold or fivefold? So we learn in the case of, there's an inclusive term in the Mishnah, which basically says, and let me just see if I could just open up the Mishnah, guys, just give me a second, because I don't want to rely on memory. Just give me a sec. Okay, so we basically learn a principle that other things were other things are included in the Mishnah. So, in other words, the Mishnah says, okay, let me just put in my own words. I was trying to pick up the Mishnah, guys. I'm so sorry, I can't find it. But we're basically saying that is it, when it comes to a thief, it's an inclusive nature that automatically when you pay a twofold, you pay a fourfold or a fivefold, depending what you stole. But we want to know with a custodian, is it an inclusive statement? Because there's a difference between a custodian and a thief. And guys, I'm going here from memory. I'm so sorry I can't share the Mishnah. I can't find it. But what actually happened is with a custodian, you might turn around and argue that originally he had permission from the owner. And therefore, he might not be eligible for the fourfold or fivefold payment. Because if the Mishnah only mentions a twofold payment, you can't necessarily say that it assumes for a custodian a fourfold and fivefold payment, because it only mentions it with regards to a thief. You might be able to say it could be, but you're not sure. So the application of who stole it would affect the coverage of what was stolen. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah.
Okay. So let me just so for any transgress, so we want to know what's the source of this in terms of the twofold payment, because it says for any transgression. So then we go into that statement and saying any transgression is a klal. It's a general principle. And the minute we mention a donkey, an ox, or a garment, that's a very specific item. And then if you look at Aveda, it's another klal, which means, or any other liability. You know what I'm saying? So the minute you learn about a general, specific, a general, you have to know that it expands it in the specific to talk about certain items, but when it generalizes it, it talks about items that are not totally general, but are general in relation to what those specific items have in common cross-sectioning. So we learned that it's an animal that carries tumah through its carcass, and birds are included because of the added inclusionary term. Okay? Now, we do realize that there's something that is excluded in this, and that is land, slaves, because why slaves? They're equated to land legally, and documents, because their value is not intrinsic. Arthur brought up a great point yesterday, that money is intrinsic because you can spend it and it has a value, and it's not seen as a document. A document is a promissory note or a deed of sale, etc. Now, I don't understand why that's not intrinsic, but apparently the definition of intrinsic, it seems from the Gemara, is that you're not buying it for its paper, you're buying it for the concept of what the paper holds. And I'm not quite sure then why money isn't included, except that today we value money more than somebody writing an IOU. However, the one argument, and I've thought about to that, is that today when you have legal documents that are, for example, a deed on a property, that's not a simple IOU. That's a legal document that you can claim ownership of the property as good as money. So that's the only question that I have. But in any way, we learn in principle that that if it's movable and has intrinsic value, then it's counted in terms of the twofold payment. Okay? And or the fourfold and fivefold if it's appropriately sheep and an ox. But also what's excluded, apart from land and slaves, is hekdesh. In other words, anything that's consecrated, because the verse says you have to, if you damage your fellow man's item, if you stole your fellow man's item. Now, I wanted to say to you that Gavin starting a share at 8. Gavin, do you want to end now and then go to your share? Because I can finish in 2 sentences.
It would be ideal, but if you need more time, you can have another 10 minutes if you need.
Okay, but how would it make you look awkward? Because I don't want that.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but it's fine. I mean, if I come a bit late, it happens, okay?
All right, so let me not take too much time, but let me just cover a little bit of ground. So basically, okay, so there's a question. So should we say that a specific, something specific, a prat, for which the carcass has tumah by touching and carrying, are including only such things? And we can't say so because the question arises, if you're talking about a carcass, then what do you do with this term, a garment? In other words, a garment doesn't contract tumah. So, you know, the mention of garment in the Chumash throws this whole thing out. So then the answer is no. Look, you've got 2 categories you have here. When you're including anything that's living, you can only include such animals that conveys tumah through its carcass. If you touch it or you move it, etc. But when you're talking about non-living items, you can include a garment. Does that make sense? But that garment itself has to have a labeling. It has to basically be attributable to somebody in terms of ownership. Otherwise, you can claim anything. Does that make sense? So garment has to have a unique label. But as far as animals are concerned, animals still have to carry tumah in their carcass in order for them to be eligible. So garment doesn't throw it off. It's a separate category. So the issue is that, well, what do we do with birds? Because the carcass doesn't have tumah. Now, in that particular case, we say, look, maybe if the Torah only wrote one specific thing, you might have been okay. It might have included birds because it might have just then been seen as a thing saying every living creature. Do you get what I'm saying? So the problem is, had it only written ox, you could have thought that we only include animals that are offered on the Mizbeach, on the altar. And had you written only donkey, you might have thought that we only include items for which the firstborn has kedusha, or is consecrated. So both of these items have a concept of consecration, the one the firstborn, and the other one kosher animals. And then the answer to that is rather the Torah should have written only an ox or a donkey. Then why not? Because if you wrote an ox or a donkey, you could come up with both conclusions. So then we learn the word that a sheep was written, or a goat, to include birds. Okay, that's a suggestion that was given. And then there's another suggestion, maybe we should only include kosher birds, because they are more similar to a sheep, because their carcasses are matame. In other words, they can even make tama the clothes of one who eats them. In other words, a kosher bird has a form of tuma, but you have to ingest it. So it is similar to an ox and a sheep and a donkey, etc., because it does have that form of tuma, but instead of touching it, you have to ingest it. But what do you do with non-kosher, what do you call it, non-kosher birds? So before we get there, we say, listen, we're throwing that statement out, because even you have to consume it, and that still is a different category. So then we say, no, listen, we don't get it from there. There's a term, all. In other words, all is an inclusionary term that would include, in that particular case, birds. That's what we've got to come to the conclusion of. Is that birds itself would be included in that inclusionary term. In other words, it has nothing to do with the general, the specific, the general. It has to be that that last statement in the Chumash is an inclusionary term to do birds. Otherwise, we've still got a problem with non-kosher birds that don't have any tumah in it. Okay. Now, let me just see. Okay, just a couple of things quickly, then we're done. So, there was a question. We don't always expound the word all. Is it to mean as an all-inclusive term? How do we know that? Because we learned that part, when you leave a corner to your field, etc. Do you remember there was a brisa that said, on cattle, flock, wine, and strong drink, when you're going to Jerusalem, you can either sell your items or you can use those items in Jerusalem and get the money equivalent. So there was a principle there where the term all wasn't an inclusive term. It was used in the term as a general term. All the things, then it specified cattle, flock, wine, and strong drink if you're taking it on the way to Jerusalem. And then it said on all that your soul requests. It's another generalization. So that you learn that in that case, the term all isn't always all-inclusive. It can be used in a generalization, specification, generalization. All right, guys, I think that's enough information for now. I hope I added some clarity to you guys.
Yeah.
Damon, just go over that part about the non-kosher birds. Non-kosher animals don't produce tumah when they die.
They absolutely do.
Non-kosher birds.
No. Let's separate between.
Hold on a sec. I'm trying to think about a human body. No. Jewish, only Jews. No, of course they do. Yeah. So what was the story?
Of course,
what
not
was
Jews. No, hang on.
No, they don't.
They do. I'll prove it to you. I'll prove it to you from two sources. I spoke to Rabbi Kabb about this.
Okay.
We learn in the war when we fought the Midianites, and there was that thing with Bilam. That we had to have, we couldn't stand under the tent of a dead body of a non-Jew.
Oh, really? Okay.
You remember, we couldn't even keep vessels, and they had to have the paraduma after the war, because they said that those that fought in the war, it was discussing the paraduma. So the thing of it is, it's a problem. And even Jeff Kaplan, who's a Cohen, there was somebody in the community that passed away that hadn't converted yet. He couldn't go to the funeral because there are sources that it's a problem.
Okay.
But where you are correct is that it's listen, I'll prove it to you. A sheretz. A sheretz is a lizard. If a lizard with no brain and no capability of doing a mitzvot a woman can't hold it in the mikveh because it could render her impure, then surely a non-Jewish person that's capable of mitzvahs and doing good things, deeds to others, maybe not kedusha, but certainly good deeds, when their soul is no longer here, the world suffers a loss. as a result of them no longer
Yeah.
being able to do good deeds. So if a lizard has got tumah, so a non-Jew's got tumah. Not the same level.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Because
Right, I'm gonna go. Cheers. Thank you
Gavin,
so
but
much.
Damon, don't go yet.
All right,
but
Gavin, was this helpful?
Damon.
Just want to know, was it helpful?
Yes, very good. Very good.
Gavin, have